Serafina Calloway gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. She wasn't supposed to be here. The towering iron gates loomed ahead, the security camera fixed on her like an unblinking eye. She inhaled sharply, her stomach knotting as the intercom crackled. "State your name." The voice was cold, clipped. "Sarah Calloway," she said, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. "Here for the—" The gates groaned open before she could finish. The mansion was nothing like she expected. It wasn't a flashy billionaire's palace. It was a fortress. Dark stone, few windows, and an air of complete isolation. She parked and stepped out, smoothing the wrinkles in her jacket. The front door swung open before she even knocked. A man in his 50s, sharp suit and sharper eyes, stood in the entryway. "Miss Calloway," he said, giving her a once-over. "Follow me." No introductions. No pleasantries. Inside, the silence pressed against her. The air smelled of polished wood and something colder, like antiseptic. She barely had time to register the grand staircase before the man led her through a hallway and stopped at a heavy door. "He doesn't like delays," he muttered before knocking once and pushing it open. Sarah stepped inside, and her pulse jumped. Cashin Thorne sat in a chair near the fireplace, one leg stretched out, wrapped in a brace. Even seated, he radiated control, his presence suffocating in its intensity. His sharp jaw, dark hair, and piercing eyes might have been breathtaking if not for the cold calculation behind them. He didn't look at her. Instead, he swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the fire. "So you're the latest one," he said. His voice was deep, disinterested. Sarah blinked. "Excuse me." "The nurse. The caretaker. Whatever they're calling it now." He took a slow sip, finally turning his gaze to her. "You won't last a week." Her spine stiffened. "I don't quit." A humorless smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That's what the last one said." Silence stretched between them. Cashin leaned back, exuding a lazy arrogance. "Let's get this over with. You follow the rules, and we won't have a problem." "Rules? Number 1, he said, setting his glass down with a soft clink. "You are not my friend. You're here to do a job. Nothing more." Sarah folded her arms, biting back a retort. "Number 2, he continued. "You don't ask about the accident." Her heartbeat quickened. The accident. The one no one had been allowed to talk about. The one that had left him like this. "And 3, his voice dropped, turning sharper. "You never enter my study. Ever." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Is that all?" His smirk returned, darker this time. "For now." The man from earlier stepped forward, handing Sarah a folder. "Your contract. Read it carefully before you sign." She took it, but didn't look away from Cashin. "What happens if I break the rules?" He held her stare, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then, he simply said, "You won't like the consequences." A challenge. Sarah lifted her chin, meeting him head-on. "I guess we'll find out." Cashin exhaled through his nose, a ghost of amusement in his expression. "I give you 3 days." She stepped forward and placed the folder on the table in front of him. "I'll take the job." For the first time, something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of surprise, gone in an instant. The air between them was charged, the battle lines drawn. 3 days? She'd prove him wrong. Sarah stood at the threshold of Cashin Thorne's bedroom, gripping the medical bag she'd brought. The heavy silence stretched between them, charged with tension. He sat in a sleek leather chair near the window, dressed in a dark Henley and sweatpants, an image of quiet defiance. He wasn't expecting her this early. That much was clear from the flicker of irritation in his sharp gaze. "You're persistent," he muttered, shifting in his seat. Sarah lifted her chin. "You hired me to do a job. That usually involves showing up." His lips twitched like he wanted to smirk, but thought better of it. She moved closer, her eyes scanning his leg. The brace extended from his knee down to his ankle, locking his movements. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched on the armrests as if bracing himself. "I need to check your mobility," she said, keeping her tone professional. "See how much weight you can put on it." His jaw flexed. "It's broken. The mobility is 0. Partial weight bearing is part of recovery," she countered, setting her bag down. "Unless you want permanent stiffness." Cashin exhaled through his nose. "Spare me the lecture. I've heard it before." "I doubt you listened." His head tilted slightly, studying her. "You always this stubborn?" Sarah shrugged. "Only when someone thinks they can intimidate me into backing down." Something flickered in his eyes, but he didn't challenge her. Instead, he gestured toward the brace with a lazy motion. "Go ahead. Knock yourself out." She crouched beside his leg, carefully undoing the straps. The skin beneath was slightly bruised, the swelling mostly gone. As she adjusted the brace, she felt his muscles tense. "You're favoring your other leg too much," she noted. "Have you even tried standing yet?" Cashin's silence was answer enough. Sarah sighed. "You can't just sit here and wait for it to heal. You have to work at it." "No," he said flatly. "You have to work at it. I just have to tolerate you being here." Sarah shot him a look, unimpressed. "You think I enjoy this?" His smirk returned, lazy and edged with amusement. "Hard to say. You do seem oddly determined." She ignored him, refastening the brace. "Tomorrow, we start mobility exercises. No arguments." Cashin leaned back, watching her with that unreadable expression. "You really think you'll last that long?" "I know I will." His chuckle was low, almost mocking. "We'll see about that." Sarah straightened, gathering her things. "Get some rest. You'll need it." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "There's a reason the last one quit." She glanced over her shoulder. "Yeah? What is it?" Cashin's eyes darkened. She got tired of being afraid. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "I don't scare easy," she said. For a long moment, he just watched her. Then, with a slow smirk, he murmured, "You will." Sarah woke to the sound of something scraping against her bedroom door. The noise was soft but deliberate, the kind of sound that didn't happen by accident. She froze, heart pounding, listening as it dragged against the wood again, slow, unhurried. She sat up, pushing the blankets aside, straining to hear beyond the heavy silence of the mansion. Her room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, but something about the air felt off, as if she wasn't alone. Holding her breath, she slid out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cool floor. She moved cautiously toward the door, every step measured. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Then, silence. The scraping had stopped. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the doorknob. Common sense told her to wait, to see if the sound returned. But instinct had her turning the handle and pulling the door open. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by soft sconces along the walls, casting long, creeping shadows. She glanced left, then right, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Then she looked down. A small piece of folded paper lay just beyond the threshold. Sarah's stomach tightened. She crouched and picked it up, unfolding it with careful fingers. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, as if written in a hurry. "Leave now, before it's too late." Her breath hitched. She turned the note over, looking for anything else, an initial, a smudge, some clue about who had left it. But there was nothing, just those 4 words, heavy with meaning. She stepped further into the hallway, scanning for anyone lurking in the shadows. The mansion was massive, filled with closed doors and endless hallways, some she hadn't even explored yet. Was someone watching her now? A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to stay calm. Someone wanted her scared, wanted her gone. Too bad for them. Jaw tightening, she crumpled the note in her fist and stepped back inside her room, locking the door behind her. She wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Morning arrived, but the unease from the night before still clung to her. Instead of going to the kitchen or checking on Cashin first thing, she headed straight for his study, the room he had explicitly told her never to enter. She knocked once before pushing the heavy door open. Cashin was at his desk, one hand resting against his temple, the other gripping a pen. He barely looked up before sighing. "You do realize this is the part where I remind you that you just broke one of my rules." Sarah stepped forward, unfazed. "Recognize this?" She tossed the crumpled note onto his desk. His eyes flickered down to it, then back to her. He didn't react. "No. You didn't leave it?" she pressed. Cashin finally leaned back, fingers tapping against the desk. "Does that seem like something I would do?" Sarah exhaled sharply. "Someone slid this under my door last night." Cashin didn't move, his expression unreadable. "And," he finally said. Her frustration flared. "And someone in this house is trying to scare me off." Cashin studied her for a long moment, then exhaled slowly, as if she were exhausting him. "Then maybe you should take the advice." Sarah's hands curled into fists. "I told you, I'm not leaving." Cashin dragged a hand through his dark hair, looking more irritated than concerned. "You're making this a bigger deal than it is. How is someone sneaking around at night, leaving threats? Not a big deal." He smirked, but there was no humor in it. "This house is full of people. Any one of them could have done it. Maybe they think they're doing you a favor." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Or maybe they don't want me finding out whatever secret you're hiding." Cashin's expression remained neutral, but she noticed the way his fingers flexed slightly against the desk, a subtle reaction, one he probably didn't even realize he'd made. She wasn't imagining things. "Stay out of things that don't concern you." he said quietly. Sarah held his gaze, her pulse picking up. She could leave it alone. Pretend she didn't notice the way his entire demeanor had shifted. But every instinct screamed that she was right, that there was something more going on here. She stepped closer. What really happened to you, Cashin? His expression hardened instantly. You're done here. Sarah didn't move. Your accident, she said. Was it really an accident? Something in his jaw tightened. For the first time since meeting him, Cashin Thorne looked at her with something dangerously close to a warning. A silent message, stop digging. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears, but she didn't look away. She had seen men like Cashin before. The kind who kept people at arm's length, who built walls so high they didn't even know how to let someone in anymore. But she wasn't afraid of him, and she wasn't backing down. Not until she got the truth. Sarah didn't see Cashin for the rest of the day. After their tense encounter in his study, he had shut her out completely, disappearing into his office and locking the door behind him. She didn't push it. Instead, she focused on familiarizing herself with the mansion, a place that still felt more like a prison than a home. The staff avoided her. She had noticed it before, but now, after the note, it was undeniable. No one met her gaze. No one spoke to her unless absolutely necessary. Even the housekeeper, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a wary demeanor, kept her distance. Someone in this house wanted her gone, but she wasn't leaving. Night fell, and Sarah stood outside Cashin's bedroom, hesitating. She had expected him to call for her when it was time for his evening physical therapy session. He hadn't. She knocked once. No response. Her pulse quickened. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was concern, but something told her she needed to check on him. She turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of the fireplace. Cashin sat in an armchair near the foot of his bed, his injured legs stretched out in front of him, a glass of whiskey in his hand. At first, she thought he was asleep. His head rested against the back of the chair, eyes closed, his expression drawn in a way she had never seen before. He looked exhausted, vulnerable. She almost stepped back out, almost gave him the privacy he probably wanted. But then she noticed the tension in his fingers, the way his free hand gripped the armrest like he was in pain. You should be in bed, she said softly. Cashin's eyes snapped open. For a second, he just stared at her, as if unsure whether she was real or if he had drifted too far into whatever haunted thoughts had been occupying his mind. Then his expression hardened, the mask sliding back into place. You're ignoring boundaries again, Calloway. Sarah shut the door behind her. You didn't call for me. I didn't need to. She folded her arms. You're in pain. Cashin smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's usually what happens when you nearly get crushed by a car. She ignored his attempt to deflect. When was the last time you took your painkillers? I don't take them. Sarah frowned. At all. His gaze flickered to the glass in his hand. Whiskey works just fine. Her stomach tightened. She had seen this before. Men who thought they could handle pain through sheer willpower alone. It never ended well. She crossed the room and kneeled beside his chair, ignoring the sharp look he gave her. Carefully, she reached for his leg, fingers brushing against the brace as she checked for swelling. Cashin stiffened. For all his arrogance, for all his sharp edges, he flinched at the lightest touch. Sarah slowed, her movements gentler now. You're tense, she murmured. He exhaled through his nose, looking away. I don't like people touching me. She didn't pull away. Instead, she worked her fingers carefully along the muscles of his calf, massaging out the stiffness, ignoring the way he tensed beneath her touch. This isn't about what you like, she said. This is about what your body needs. Cashin didn't respond, but he didn't stop her either. For a long time, there was only silence. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows along the walls. His breathing, slow and measured, was the only sound between them. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he said, They told you, didn't they? Sarah's hand stilled. Told me what? Cashin's eyes darkened. Why the last nurse left. She hesitated. They said she was afraid, she admitted. His fingers curled tighter around the armrest. And you're not. No. His lips pressed into a thin line. You should be. Sarah met his gaze, unflinching. Why? Cashin studied her for a long moment. Then he looked away. You should go. She didn't move. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. You're wasting your time, Calloway. I'm not some broken thing you can fix. Sarah stood slowly, letting the weight of his words settle between them. Good, she said. Because that's not what I'm trying to do. She turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. Get some rest, she said over her shoulder. Tomorrow, we start your real recovery. Cashin didn't respond. But as she stepped out, closing the door behind her, she could feel his eyes on her, watching, calculating, and maybe, just maybe, a little less cold than before. Sarah arrived in Cashin's room earlier than usual the next morning. She expected him to be asleep, exhausted from the pain that had clearly worn him down the night before. Instead, she found him exactly where she had left him, sitting in that same chair near the fireplace, awake, his expression blank as he watched the flames. He didn't acknowledge her when she entered. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Without a word, she set her bag down and crossed the room. His leg was propped up on a low ottoman, the brace still locked in place. His posture was stiff, tense, like his body was rebelling against the lack of movement. "You didn't sleep," she said, more observation than question. Cashin exhaled slowly. "I didn't need to." "Liar." She crouched beside his leg, ignoring the way he watched her as she unfastened the brace. His knee was still slightly swollen, but not as much as before. That was the only good news. The bad news was the muscle tension. His refusal to move was already working against him. She glanced up. "We need to start mobility exercises today." Cashin didn't react. "I thought we already did this part." "No," she said. "Last night was me being nice. Today, you actually do the work." He smirked faintly, but there was no humor in it. "I don't think you understand how this arrangement works." "Your body is already stiffening," she countered. "You keep avoiding therapy, you'll be dealing with permanent damage. Which, let me guess, isn't something you want." Cashin studied her for a long moment before finally sighing. "Fine, let's get this over with." Sarah helped him shift to the edge of the chair, keeping one hand on his arm as he adjusted. When he planted his good foot on the floor and tried to push himself up, she saw the exact moment pain shot through him. His jaw clenched. His breath hitched. He gripped the chair so tightly his knuckles went white. "Stop," she said immediately. Cashin ignored her. "Cashin," she snapped, tightening her grip on his arm. "I said stop." His body trembled slightly from the effort before he finally sank back down, his breathing heavy. He stared at the floor, silent, shoulders taut. She let go of him, watching the way his hands flexed against his thighs. Not in pain, but frustration. She had seen men like him before, men who prided themselves on their strength, on their ability to control everything around them. And when that control was taken away, even for a moment, it left them raw, exposed. Cashin wasn't just fighting the injury. He was fighting himself. "Pushing through pain won't make it heal faster," she said, keeping her voice level. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "That's not how it works in my world." Sarah tilted her head. "What does that mean?" Cashin didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, fingers laced together. His silence was different this time. Not avoidance, not arrogance, something else. Sarah shifted, glancing around the room. It was dark, lined with heavy bookshelves and thick curtains, as if Cashin had deliberately built himself a world where light barely reached. Then her eyes landed on something she hadn't noticed before. A framed photo, tucked away on the bookshelf behind his chair. A much younger Cashin stood beside a woman, mid-20s, blonde, striking. Her smile was effortless, her arm draped around his shoulder like she had known him forever. Cashin, however, looked different. Not as closed off, not as haunted. Before she could think better of it, she asked, "Who is she?" Cashin went completely still. For a second, she thought he hadn't heard her. But then he turned his head, his eyes flicking to the photo. His fingers twitched slightly, a reaction so subtle most people wouldn't have caught it. But Sarah did. His expression shuddered almost instantly, and he reached for his brace, adjusting the straps. "Your job is to help me walk," he said, voice cold. "Not dig through my past." Sarah held his gaze. "You were different in that picture." Cashin's jaw tightened. "Calloway." She ignored the warning in his tone. "You looked happy." Cashin exhaled through his nose, his patience clearly wearing thin. "And," Sarah leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. "And I'm trying to understand the man I'm working for." His eyes darkened. "There's nothing to understand." Silence stretched between them. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he murmured, "That photo was taken years ago." Sarah studied him carefully. "What happened to her?" Cashin's fingers curled into fists, his entire body going rigid. The moment stretched too long, the air thick with something unspoken. But then, just like that, the mask was back in place. He leaned back, smirking slightly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "She's gone." Sarah swallowed. "Gone where?" Cashin's gaze turned sharp, almost cutting. "Does it matter?" Sarah didn't know what answer she was expecting, but the way he said it, the way his voice went quieter, heavier, told her one thing. Whoever she was, whoever this woman had been, she wasn't just gone. She was lost. Sarah didn't push further. Not yet. Instead, she moved to his side, adjusting the brace again. "Try standing up," she said, her tone softer this time. Cashin hesitated, then shifted his weight forward. This time, when he stood, she felt him lean on her slightly, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. But he did it. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders still there, but less rigid. Sarah tightened her grip just a fraction. He glanced down at her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. For the first time since she had arrived, Cashin Thorne looked at her like he wasn't sure what to make of her. And for some reason, that felt more dangerous than anything else. The tension in the mansion was growing thicker. Sarah felt it in the way the staff avoided her, their conversations halting whenever she entered a room. She saw it in the way Cashin held himself, the shadows in his eyes deepening, his patience thinning. Something was shifting beneath the surface, something unseen but impossible to ignore. She hadn't forgotten about the note. She had spent the past 2 days watching, searching for any clue about who might have left it. But no one acted suspiciously, at least, not in an obvious way. The housekeeper, Elise, remained distant. The security team barely acknowledged her. Even the butler, Wallace, kept interactions brief. Whoever had warned her wanted her out. But why? She was beginning to suspect it had less to do with her and more to do with Cashin himself. He was hiding something, and she wasn't sure if she was getting closer to the truth or if she was walking straight into danger. That night, she left Cashin's room after another grueling therapy session, her muscles aching almost as much as his probably did. He had made progress, standing for longer stretches, putting more weight on his leg. But the frustration remained. He hated the weakness, the dependence. He hated needing her. Sarah made her way to the kitchen, hoping a cup of tea would help her unwind. She passed through the quiet hallways, the low glow of the sconces casting long, eerie shadows. Then she saw it. A second note. This one sat on the kitchen counter, placed neatly, almost deliberately, as if the writer had known she would find it. Her chest tightened as she unfolded the paper. "Stop asking questions. You won't like the answers." A chill crept down her spine. This wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. Sarah inhaled sharply, glancing around the empty kitchen. The staff had already retired for the night. The mansion was silent. Someone had put this here, knowing she would be alone. Her hands clenched around the note. She wasn't afraid of intimidation tactics. But this confirmed something she had already suspected. Cashin's accident wasn't an accident at all. And someone in this house knew the truth. Sarah folded the note and tucked it into her pocket. She wasn't going to stop asking questions. She was going to find the answers, whether they liked it or not. Cashin was waiting for her when she returned to his room. He had moved from his chair to the edge of the bed, his legs stretched out, tension lining his face. His eyes flicked to her the moment she stepped inside, sharp and knowing. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said. Sarah shut the door behind her. "Not a ghost." Cashin arched a brow. "Then what?" She hesitated. Should she tell him? Would he even care? He had made it clear that his past wasn't her concern. But the note wasn't just about her. It was about whatever had happened to him. She reached into her pocket and tossed the folded paper onto the nightstand. "Someone left this for me." Cashin's gaze darkened as he picked up the note and unfolded it. His expression didn't change as he read the words, but something in his posture stiffened. He let out a slow breath, then crumpled the paper in his fist. "You should have thrown this away." Sarah frowned. "So you're not even going to ask who left it?" "I already know the answer." Her pulse quickened. "Who?" Cashin's lips pressed into a thin line. He tossed the crumpled note into the fireplace, watching as the flames devoured the paper. "You want my advice?" "Not really," she muttered. He smirked faintly. "Stop looking for things you don't want to find." Sarah crossed her arms. "Why? Because it'll get me in trouble? Or because it'll force you to face whatever you're running from?" Cashin's jaw flexed. "Calloway." "No," she stepped closer. "You keep telling me to leave things alone, but someone in this house is trying to scare me off. You think I can just ignore that?" Cashin studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "This house has secrets," he admitted, "ones that are better left buried." Sarah swallowed. "You really believe that?" He held her gaze, something heavy behind his eyes. "Yes." Silence settled between them, thick and charged. Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't scare easily, Cashin." His smirk returned, but this time it was almost sad. I know. Something about the way he said it sent a chill through her. Like he wasn't warning her to protect himself. He was warning her to protect her. And that terrified her more than anything else. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the darkness of the mansion pressing in around her. Every breath felt too loud in the silence. The second note had changed everything. Someone didn't just want her gone. They wanted her to stop. Stop asking questions. You won't like the answers. She turned onto her side, fingers curled into the blanket. The warning echoed in her head, looping over and over until it was impossible to ignore. She had come here expecting resistance. Cashin had made it clear from the start that he didn't want her around. But this was different. This wasn't Cashin pushing her away. This was someone else. Someone watching, waiting. And that terrified her more than she wanted to admit. But fear had never been enough to stop her before. And it wasn't going to stop her now. The library was empty when she entered the next morning. She had barely spent any time in this part of the house. But something told her it was the right place to start. It was massive, lined with towering bookshelves and expensive furniture, a fireplace dominating one wall. The kind of room meant to impress guests, not actually be used. But someone had used it. There were faint impressions on the carpet where a chair had been moved. A single glass on the table, the rim stained with whiskey. A book left open on the desk, not in the middle of the pages, but near the back, as if someone had flipped through for something specific. Sarah moved closer, scanning the title. Legal Affairs, the Hale and Thorne Merger. Her stomach tightened. Hale. The name meant nothing to her, but something about it felt wrong. The way it was printed in bold, the way it sat beside Thorne as if the two were forever intertwined. She pulled the book closer, flipping to the first few pages. It was a contract, an old one, from nearly a decade ago, outlining a merger between two companies, Thorne Industries and Hale Enterprises. Cashin's family business. And someone else's. Sarah turned another page, scanning the fine print. But before she could get any further, something else caught her eye. A single photograph, tucked between the pages, almost as if someone had hidden it there. She pulled it free, her breath catching. It was the same woman from the picture in Cashin's room. Blonde, smiling, effortless. But this time, she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, tall, dark-haired, sharp features. And next to them, Cashin. He was younger, maybe mid-20s, but there was something different in his face. He wasn't as closed off, not as haunted. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the photo. Someone had hidden this for a reason. Someone didn't want her finding it. Sarah turned the picture over, searching for a date. 7 years ago. The unease in her stomach grew. Who was this man? And why had Cashin hidden this photo away? Her heartbeat quickened. She needed answers. And there was only one person who could give them to her. Cashin was waiting for her when she entered his room. Not by the fireplace. Not in his chair. He was standing. The sight sent a strange sense of relief through her, until she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the stiffness in his jaw. He was leaning heavily on his good leg, one hand braced against the desk for support. But it wasn't just the pain that had his body locked in place. It was something else. Something darker. His eyes flicked to the photo in her hand. Then, in an instant, his entire demeanor changed. His features sharpened, his body going rigid. His grip on the desk tightened, the veins in his hand visible beneath his skin. Where did you get that? His voice was dangerously low. Sarah hesitated. The library. Cashin exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. You went digging. I went looking for answers, she corrected, since you refused to give me any. Silence. He didn't look at the photo again, didn't reach for it. He just stood there, perfectly still, tension rolling off him in waves. Sarah stepped forward, holding the photo up between them. Who is he? Cashin's fingers curled against the desk. Then, finally, he spoke. Ezra Hale. The name sent a shiver through her, not because she recognized it, but because of the way Cashin said it. Quiet, weighted, dangerous. Sarah glanced at the photo again. He knew you. Cashin let out a humorless laugh. Yeah, he murmured. He knew me. Sarah's pulse quickened. What happened to him? Cashin's jaw flexed. He's dead. She swallowed hard. How? Cashin turned away, staring out the window. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, I killed him. The words hit like a physical force. The air between them went impossibly still. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, but Cashin didn't look at her, didn't offer an explanation. He just stood there, his body a wall, his expression unreadable. But something in the way he said it, something in the way the words settled into the air, sent a chill through her. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an apology. It was a fact, plain, cold. unshakable. The room felt suffocating. The walls, the fire, the silence pressing in around them. Sarah forced herself to swallow, to push through the thick knot forming in her throat. "You killed him," she echoed, voice barely above a whisper. Cashin finally turned to face her. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, locked onto hers, something dark flickering behind them. "Still want to keep asking questions?" Her heart pounded. She should have been afraid. She should have stepped back, should have looked at him the way everyone else did, with fear, with caution, with hesitation. But she didn't, because beneath the ice in his eyes, beneath the perfect control, she saw something else. Something haunted, something broken. And for the first time, she realized Cashin Thorne wasn't just afraid of someone else finding out the truth. He was afraid of what the truth would do to her. Sarah didn't move. Cashin's words still hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. "I killed him." She should have felt something. Shock, fear, hesitation. But all she felt was the steady, thrumming certainty that she had finally stepped too close to the edge of something dangerous. Something Cashin had spent years keeping buried. His expression was unreadable, his body still as stone, but she could see it now, the fracture beneath the surface. The weight he carried, the ghosts that haunted him. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the photograph. "Tell me what happened." Cashin let out a slow breath. He didn't look at her. Instead, he turned toward the window, his gaze fixed on the sprawling, mist-covered estate beyond the glass. "Go back to your room, Calloway." "No." His head tilted slightly at her defiance, but he didn't turn around. "You keep asking questions, but you don't seem to understand that you won't like the answers. Let me decide that." Silence. The fire crackled behind them, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. Sarah could feel her own heartbeat hammering in her chest, the tension so thick it felt like the air had turned to glass. One wrong word, and everything would shatter. She took a cautious step forward. Cashin. He moved fast, too fast for someone still recovering from an injury. One moment he was across the room. The next he was inches from her, his hand closing over her wrist with just enough pressure to make her stop, his body radiating heat and tension. "Stop," he said, voice low, controlled. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't move away. She just stared up at him, at the sharp angles of his face, the war raging behind his eyes. "Not until you tell me the truth," she whispered. Cashin exhaled sharply through his nose, his grip loosening. He ran a hand through his hair, looking away as if the conversation physically pained him. "Fine," he muttered, voice rough. "You want the truth?" Sarah nodded. Cashin's jaw clenched, but finally, he spoke. Ezra Hale wasn't just some business partner. He was family. Sarah's breath hitched. "He and I grew up together. His father and mine built their companies side by side, planning to merge them when we took over. He was supposed to be my brother-in-law." Sarah's grip tightened on the photo. The woman in the picture, she wasn't just someone from Cashin's past. She had been part of his future. "What happened?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Cashin laughed, but there was no humor in it. Ezra got greedy. His fingers drummed against the desk, a sharp, rhythmic sound. He wanted more control, more power. He didn't want to merge our companies. He wanted to take everything. Sarah swallowed hard. "And Evelyn?" Cashin's head snapped toward her at the name. For the first time since she had stepped into the room, something cracked in his expression. "Where did you hear that name?" She hesitated. "I saw it in your medical records. You listed her as an emergency contact." Cashin exhaled, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Evelyn was my fiancée." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and Sarah's stomach twisted. She was Ezra's sister. Cashin nodded. "He didn't just betray me. He betrayed her, too." Sarah felt like she was standing in the eye of a storm, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. Cashin turned away again, staring into the fire. "We found out about his plan too late. He had already started moving money, shifting assets. By the time we confronted him, he was too deep to back out." Sarah swallowed. "What happened?" Cashin's voice was eerily calm. "He made a choice." Something in his tone made her shiver. "What choice?" Cashin met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw it. The guilt, the regret. "He tried to get rid of me." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her mind reeled. "You mean, he cut the brakes on my car?" A cold chill ran down her spine. Cashin let out a slow, steady breath, his hands flexing at his sides. "It was supposed to look like an accident. It almost worked. But Evelyn..." His voice broke. Sarah's stomach twisted. "She was in the car with you." Cashin nodded. The firelight flickered against his face, casting sharp shadows along his jaw. "She died on impact." Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth. her heart aching at the raw pain in his voice. I survived, he continued. Barely. But Ezra. His fingers curled into fists. I made sure he paid. Sarah's pulse pounded. You killed him. Cashin didn't deny it. He didn't deserve to walk away from what he did. Sarah swallowed hard, her body tense. Does anyone else know? Cashin shook his head. Not the full story. She exhaled. This was why he had warned her. Why he had told her to stop asking questions. Not because he was afraid of what she would find. Because he was afraid of what it would mean for her if she did. Sarah looked at him. Really looked at him. This wasn't just about Ezra. It was about the weight Cashin had carried every day since. The guilt. The anger. The loss. He hadn't just been mourning Evelyn. He had been mourning the man he had been before. And now, because of her, the past had been dragged back into the light. She didn't know what to say. Didn't know if there were words that could make any of this easy. So instead, she stepped closer, placing a hand over his. Cashin flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away. For a long moment, they just stood there, the silence stretching between them. Then, finally, Cashin exhaled, his body sagging under the weight of everything he had just told her. And for the first time since she had met him, Sarah realized Cashin Thorne wasn't just broken. He was still bleeding. Sarah didn't move. Cashin's words still echoed in her head, sharp and unrelenting. Ezra Hale is dead. I killed him. Her breath felt caught in her throat, her mind scrambling to process what he had just admitted. The weight of it pressed against her ribs, heavy and suffocating. Cashin stood in front of the fireplace, his body rigid, his face carefully blank. But Sarah knew better. This wasn't just a confession. It was a warning. She swallowed hard, tightening her grip on the photograph she had found. Tell me everything. Cashin exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his dark hair. His fingers curled slightly at the ends, like he was trying to restrain something. Frustration, regret, maybe even anger. You don't want to know. Yes, I do, Sarah insisted, her voice firm despite the uncertainty churning in her stomach. I wouldn't be asking if I didn't. He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she could handle whatever he was about to say. Then, after a tense silence, he turned away, gripping the mantelpiece like it was the only thing anchoring him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and controlled, but there was an edge to it, something raw and fractured beneath the surface. Ezra and I weren't just business partners, he said, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. We were family. We grew up together. Our fathers built an empire side by side, always planning for the day we'd take over. It was supposed to be a partnership that lasted for generations. A humorless smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, but Ezra didn't want to share. Sarah took a slow breath, her pulse steady but quickening. So he betrayed you. Cashin gave a short nod. At first, it was small. Money moved in ways it shouldn't have been, deals that didn't make sense. I thought he was just being reckless. But then I dug deeper. His fingers flexed against the mantel. He wasn't just trying to take the company. He was trying to erase me from it entirely. Sarah's stomach tightened. Cashin finally turned, his expression unreadable. I confronted him. I gave him the chance to explain himself. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. He didn't even bother lying. Sarah swallowed. What did he say? Cashin's jaw tightened. He said I was in his way. Silence thickened between them. The pieces were falling into place, but she still didn't have the full picture. She took a cautious step forward. What did he do? Cashin let out a slow breath. He made sure I wouldn't be a problem anymore. A chill ran down her spine. How? His eyes darkened. He cut the brakes on my car. Sarah's heart stopped for a beat. Cashin's expression remained eerily calm. It was supposed to look like a mechanical failure. A tragic accident. No investigation. No suspicions. He exhaled. Just a clean way to get rid of me. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. But you survived. His features tightened. Evelyn didn't. Her stomach twisted. She had suspected it. Somewhere deep down, she had already known. But hearing him say it made it real. Cashin's voice grew quieter. She wasn't supposed to be in the car. We had argued earlier that day, and she wanted to fix things. He swallowed hard, so she got in. The sheer weight of his grief settled between them, thick and suffocating. She died on impact, he said. His voice was hollow, absent of emotion. I should have too. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She could see it now, the crash, the aftermath, the devastation. She forced herself to speak. And Ezra? Cashin's fingers curled into fists. He got away with it. Sarah's pulse pounded. There was no proof. Cashin nodded. Nothing that would hold up in court. Nothing that would make a difference. The air between them crackled. And that's when I realized, Cashin said, if the law wouldn't handle him, I would. Sarah's breath hitched. What did you do? She whispered. Cashin exhaled. I confronted him one last time. A muscle ticked in his jaw. I told him I knew everything, that he could either turn himself in or deal with me. He let out a dark, humorless chuckle. He laughed in my face. Sarah could see it now. Two men standing across from each other, one full of arrogance, the other full of rage. A moment that had defined the rest of Cashin's life. Cashin's voice dropped lower. So I did what he tried to do to me. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She didn't ask how. She didn't need to. The truth was already there, hanging in the silence between them. Ezra Hale had died because Cashin had made sure of it. The fire flickered, casting shadows across the walls. Sarah forced herself to swallow, her throat dry. You killed him, she said. Cashin didn't deny it. He didn't say anything at all. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Then, finally, he spoke. He deserved worse. His voice was calm, steady, absolute. Sarah exhaled slowly. And no one knows? No one who matters, he said. Sarah could barely hear her own thoughts over the pounding of her heartbeat. She had known Cashin was hiding something. She had known that whatever had happened to him was dark, tangled in shadows and regret. But this was something else entirely. Cashin had taken a life, and now, he was looking at her like he was waiting for her to leave, waiting for the disgust, the fear, the horror to set in, waiting for her to walk away. Sarah didn't move, didn't step back, didn't look at him any differently than she had before. Because beneath the anger, beneath the weight of everything he carried, she saw the truth. He hadn't just lost Evelyn. He had lost himself. And for the first time, Sarah realized Cashin Thorne wasn't just broken. He was still bleeding. Sarah had expected to feel different after Cashin's confession. He had told her the kind of truth that shattered things, the kind that left permanent cracks in the foundation of what she thought she knew. But instead of fear, instead of disgust, she felt something else. Certainty. The certainty that Cashin Thorne wasn't a villain, and the certainty that someone, somewhere, still wanted him to suffer, because accidents didn't happen twice. And Cashin's past was far from finished with him. The next evening, Sarah left Cashin's room later than usual. He had pushed himself harder during therapy, forcing his injured leg to take more weight, refusing to let her help him when he nearly collapsed. It was always the same battle, Cashin versus himself. His body, his pain, his past. And now, she knew why. He wasn't just trying to heal. He was trying to outrun the ghosts clawing at his heels. She sighed as she stepped into the dimly lit hallway, rolling the stiffness from her shoulders. The mansion was quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the house itself was holding its breath. She had taken only a few steps when she felt it. A shift in the air. A presence. Sarah's heart kicked up, her instincts screaming at her to turn around. But before she could react, a hand shot out of the shadows, grabbing her wrist. She gasped, yanking back, but the grip was ironclad. A second later, another hand wrapped around her mouth, muffling her scream. Adrenaline surged through her veins. She twisted, kicking blindly, her body slamming into something solid, a chest, a shoulder. Whoever it was, they were strong, but she wasn't weak. She drove her elbow back with as much force as she could muster. A grunt of pain. The grip loosened just enough for her to rip free. Sarah stumbled backward, sucking in a sharp breath, her eyes darting through the darkness. The hallway was too dim, the sconces casting just enough light to create deep, shifting shadows. She couldn't see his face, just the shape of him. Tall, broad, watching, waiting. The man took a step forward, and her blood ran cold. Stop, she warned, her voice sharp despite the fear lacing her spine. He didn't. Her heart pounded. She took a step back, calculating. The hallway split a few feet behind her. One path led to the stairwell, the other to Cashin's study. If she ran, she didn't get the chance to decide. The man lunged. Sarah twisted at the last second, narrowly avoiding his grasp. She spun, sprinting toward the study, her breath ragged, her pulse a violent drum against her ribs. She hit the door at full speed, shoving it open and slamming it shut behind her. The lock clicked into place. Silence. She pressed her back against the wood, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The seconds stretched, the weight of the darkness pressing in. Then, a single knock, slow, deliberate. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. The door was thick, solid wood, but it wasn't enough to make her feel safe. A second knock, louder. She exhaled shakily, forcing her mind to work through the panic. There had to be another way out. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the large window behind the desk. It was risky, but it was her only option. She moved fast, shoving aside a chair, her fingers fumbling with the latch. The window creaked open, the cold night air rushing in. She swung one leg over the sill, gripping the frame as she prepared to drop down to the gravel path below. Then she heard it. A voice, muffled through the door. Low. Amused. You should have left when you had the chance. A sharp chill shot down her spine. She didn't stop to think. She jumped. The impact jarred her bones, pain jolting up her ankles as she landed on the hard gravel. She stumbled, but kept moving, sprinting toward the side of the mansion. Lights flickered ahead, security lamps lining the long driveway. If she could just. A shape moved in the shadows. Her stomach flipped. Another one. Two figures stood at the end of the path, their faces obscured by the darkness. Waiting for her. Her pulse thundered. She skidded to a stop, her mind racing. If she turned back, she'd be cornered. But if she kept going. One of the figures took a slow step forward. Then another. Sarah clenched her teeth. No. She refused to be prey. She whirled, sprinting toward the nearest side door, the one leading into the east wing of the house. If she could get inside, if she could. A hand closed around her arm. She screamed, twisting violently, but the grip was strong. Sarah. Cashin's voice. The panic in her chest cracked, air flooding back into her lungs. Her eyes snapped up, locking onto his. He was standing just outside the door, his body tense, his breathing uneven. He wasn't using his cane. He had run to get to her. Inside, he ordered, yanking her forward. She didn't argue. She stumbled through the doorway, Cashin slamming it shut behind them. His arm came around her, steadying her as she caught her breath. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Cashin turned toward the nearest window, peering through the heavy curtains. His jaw tightened. They're gone, he muttered. Sarah's stomach churned. You don't know that. Cashin exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. His pulse was visible at his throat, his muscles still coiled with tension. Then, slowly, he turned to her. His expression was unreadable, but she saw it. The shift, the realization. This wasn't just about his past anymore. This was about her. Sarah swallowed hard. They were waiting for me. Cashin didn't respond, didn't deny it, because they both knew the truth now. This wasn't a warning. It was a message. And whoever had sent it wasn't finished yet. Sarah sat on the edge of the couch in Cashin's study, her body still thrumming with adrenaline. Her hands were clenched into fists, her breathing uneven. Across the room, Cashin stood near the fireplace, his expression hard, unreadable. He hadn't said a word since pulling her inside. Outside, the mansion was silent, too silent. She had spent the past few minutes listening, waiting for footsteps, for voices, for anything that would indicate the men who had chased her were still out there. But there was nothing. It was like they had disappeared into the night. Or worse, like they had never been there at all. Cashin finally spoke, his voice low, controlled. Tell me exactly what happened. Sarah forced herself to exhale, pushing through the tightness in her chest. I left your room. The hallway was dark, but I felt it. Someone was there. Before I could react, he grabbed me. Cashin's grip tightened around the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. I fought him off, but he wasn't alone, she continued. When I ran, I could see them waiting for me outside. She hesitated. They knew I'd come that way. They were expecting me. Cashin's jaw tightened. Did you see their faces? No, she shook her head. It was too dark. Silence stretched between them. Then Cashin turned, heading toward the small bar cart in the corner. He poured a drink with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't offer her one. He took a sip, exhaled sharply, then set the glass down with just a little too much force. They're escalating, he muttered. Sarah's stomach twisted. Cashin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, his movements tight, restless. You were right, he admitted, his voice quieter now. This isn't about the past anymore. It's about now. About you. Sarah swallowed hard. Why? Cashin exhaled. Because you're too close. The weight of his words settled in the air. Sarah leaned forward, her pulse still racing. Then tell me, Cashin, who the hell are we dealing with? He hesitated. Then, finally, he spoke. There were people connected to Ezra. People who lost when he died. Sarah's blood ran cold. You mean his business partners? Cashin nodded. He wasn't just embezzling from my company. He was involved in something bigger. Deals with people who don't forgive debts. A sharp chill ran through her. And when he died, they blamed me. The words were soft, but the weight behind them was unbearable. Sarah's chest tightened. So they came after you. Cashin's smirk was humorless. At first, it was small things. Surveillance. A A few broken deals. A warning, meant to push me out of the business completely. But when I didn't fold, they got bolder. Her pulse pounded. Your accident. Cashin met her gaze. It wasn't an accident. Sarah inhaled sharply. They tried to kill me the same way Ezra did. He gestured to his injured leg. This time they failed. Sarah felt a sickening twist in her stomach. And now they think I'm a threat, too. Cashin's expression hardened. Because you are. The air between them felt suffocating. Sarah took a slow breath, forcing her voice to stay steady. Then we need to stop waiting for them to make the next move. Cashin arched a brow. And what do you suggest, Calloway? That we invite them in for tea and politely ask them to stop trying to kill us. Sarah crossed her arms. No. I suggest we find them first. A muscle ticked in Cashin's jaw. You don't know what you're asking for. Sarah stood, stepping closer. I know that if we don't act now, they'll keep coming. You know that, Cashin. He exhaled, looking away. She watched him carefully. He was always so in control, always one step ahead. But now? He looked like a man who had spent years preparing for a battle he never wanted to fight. And she had just forced him to step onto the battlefield. They worked in silence. Cashin sat at his desk, pulling up old records, while Sarah paced, thinking through everything they knew. Every detail mattered now. We need to start with Ezra's old connections, she said, half to herself. Who was still working with him before he died? Cashin exhaled. More people than I could count. But if they're the ones pulling the strings now, they would have stayed close to the company. He pulled up a list of recent financial transactions, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. The numbers flashed across the screen, streams of data flowing like water. Then he stopped. His shoulders went rigid. What? Sarah moved behind him, scanning the screen. What did you find? Cashin didn't speak for a moment. Then, there's a name that keeps showing up in the records. Sarah frowned. Whose? Cashin turned the screen toward her. Her stomach dropped. Alexander Sterling. Sarah's hands clenched at her sides. Who is he? Cashin's expression darkened. A former board member. He was one of Ezra's closest allies before everything went to hell. Sarah studied the numbers on the screen. Sterling's name appeared again and again, linked to offshore accounts, shell corporations. Money moving in and out. Transactions that shouldn't exist. And then, at the very bottom, the final transaction. From a private account. A large sum of money transferred just 2 days ago. Cashin's grip tightened around the edge of the desk. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a goddamn contract. Sarah's breath caught. You mean? Cashin's gaze met hers. His voice colder than she had ever heard it. They didn't just want to scare you. His jaw clenched. They paid to have you killed. The room fell silent. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. She forced herself to breathe, to think, to not let the fear win. But she wasn't naive. This was bigger than she had thought, bigger than either of them. And now, it was personal. Cashin's voice broke through the silence. If Sterling's involved, that means this isn't over. He exhaled, his gaze sharp. They won't stop until they get what they want. Sarah met his eyes, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. Then we make sure they don't get it. Cashin studied her for a moment. Then, slowly, a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Looks like you're in this now, Calloway. Sarah's lips parted, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. I've been in this since the moment I walked through your door. Cashin nodded once, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. Then let's end it. Sarah stood in the center of Cashin's study, her fingers pressed against the smooth surface of the desk as she stared at the name glowing on the computer screen. Alexander Sterling, the man behind the attack, the one who had paid to have her killed. Her pulse pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was exactly what they needed, proof. They finally had something concrete. A name, a lead, a target. Cashin leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His face was unreadable, but his fingers drummed once against the edge of the desk, a small, almost imperceptible tell that Sarah had learned to recognize. He was furious, not the kind of fury that lashed out recklessly, the kind that simmered, waiting, calculating. Sterling was one of the few people who knew the full scope of Ezra's operations, Cashin said. His voice measured, clipped. When Ezra died, he must have picked up the pieces. He wouldn't have done it alone, but he would have made sure he wasn't the one getting his hands dirty. Sarah frowned. Then why go after you now? Why not just let things die with Ezra? Cashin's jaw flexed. Because I didn't let them. She studied him. What do you mean? He hesitated, just for a second, and that was enough. Sarah narrowed her eyes. Cashin. His fingers tapped against the desk again before he finally exhaled. running a hand through his hair. I was investigating him. Sarah blinked. You what? Cashin leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his gaze sharp. Before you got here, before the accident, I had already started pulling records, tracking accounts. Sterling thought he had covered his tracks, but there were discrepancies. I was getting close. A sharp chill ran through her. So the accident wasn't an accident, Cashin finished, his voice grim. It was a warning, a message. They thought if they took me out, everything would stop. Sarah's stomach twisted. And now that I've been asking questions, now that I've started pushing, they see you as a threat, too. The air in the study felt impossibly thick. Sarah exhaled slowly, pushing past the fear clawing at her chest. Then we don't give them the chance to come after us again. We go after them first. Cashin smirked, but there was no humor in it. You're really committed to this whole recklessly throwing yourself into danger thing, aren't you? Sarah crossed her arms. You're one to talk. His smirk deepened slightly, but then it was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper. He turned back to the computer, fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. We need to figure out where Sterling is now, he said. And who else is working with him? Sarah nodded, stepping closer. How do we do that? Cashin didn't answer immediately. He opened a separate file, scrolling through old reports, financial statements, records that had been buried beneath layers of deception. Then he stopped. His body went rigid. Sarah frowned. What is it? Cashin's expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the screen. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. There's another name. Sarah moved beside him, her eyes scanning the text. Her breath caught in her throat. Wallace Greaves. She felt her stomach drop. That's not possible, she whispered. Cashin exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tightening into fists. He's been here for years, he murmured. Long before Ezra was gone. He was close to my father. He helped run this house. I trusted him. Sarah's pulse pounded. He's the one who let them in. Cashin nodded grimly. The attack on you? The notes? He knew the security system better than anyone. He wouldn't have needed to force his way in. He could have just walked through the door. Sarah felt nausea coil in her stomach. She had never trusted Wallace, but she had never thought. Her hands clenched into fists. Where is he now? Cashin's jaw tightened. If he's working with Sterling, then he knows we're onto them. Sarah's breath quickened. Then we need to find him before he disappears. Cashin nodded once. Let's move. They found Wallace near the east wing of the mansion. He was packing. Sarah's stomach twisted as she stepped into the room, Cashin right behind her. Wallace's back was turned, but he must have sensed them because he froze, his hands stilling over the open suitcase on the bed. Slowly he turned. His face was carefully blank, but his eyes flickered, first to Cashin, then to Sarah. So, he murmured, his voice calm. Even. You figured it out. Cashin stepped forward. Tell me why. Wallace exhaled, closing the suitcase with a soft thud. It was never personal. Cashin let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Not personal. His gaze darkened. You let them into my house. You let them come after her. Wallace's expression didn't change. They gave me a choice, Cashin. I took the only one that let me walk away. Sarah clenched her teeth. That's a lie. Wallace's gaze flicked to her. Is it? She didn't blink. You had another choice. You could have warned him. You could have done something. Anything. Besides selling him out. Wallace's jaw tightened. You don't understand the kind of men you're dealing with. Cashin's voice dropped. Then make me understand. Wallace exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Sterling wanted control. He wanted to finish what Ezra started. When you started digging, he saw it as a threat. His gaze flickered to Sarah. And when she started digging, they saw it as an opportunity. A sharp chill ran down Sarah's spine. What kind of opportunity? Wallace hesitated. Cashin's patience snapped. Tell me. Wallace exhaled. They didn't just want her dead. They wanted to use her to get to you, to control you. Sarah felt her stomach twist, her skin prickling with unease. Cashin's entire body went still. Then, in a voice so low it barely registered, he asked, Where is Sterling now? Wallace hesitated for half a second too long. Cashin stepped forward, his expression turning deadly. Where? Wallace exhaled sharply. The Hale estate. Tonight. Cashin's eyes flashed. Then that's where we're going. Sarah swallowed hard, her pulse thrumming. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about ending it, once and for all. The Hale estate loomed ahead, a sprawling relic of old money and blood-stained history. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of Cashin's car, gripping the edge of the seat as he pulled onto the long, winding driveway. The night was thick, the sky a vast stretch of blackness, but the mansion stood illuminated, golden lights casting eerie shadows against the stone exterior. They weren't sneaking in. They wanted Sterling to know they were coming. Cashin's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white. He hadn't spoken much since they had left the mansion, but Sarah didn't need words to know what he was thinking. This was it. One way or another, it ended tonight. The tires crunched against the gravel as he brought the car to a stop. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The house seemed unnervingly quiet. Then Cashin exhaled, the sound slow and measured. "Stay behind me." Sarah shot him a sharp look. "Not a chance." Cashin turned, his expression dark. "Sarah." She shook her head. "I didn't come this far to hide in the background. We do this together." His jaw flexed, but after a beat, he gave a single nod. "Fine. But if things go wrong, you run." Sarah didn't respond, because she wasn't running. Not anymore. The doors to the estate were already open when they stepped inside. A welcoming invitation. A trap. Cashin moved first, his stride controlled, shoulders squared. Sarah followed closely, her pulse a steady drum in her ears. The grand foyer stretched before them, a massive chandelier glittering overhead, the scent of aged wood and expensive cologne clinging to the air. Then footsteps, slow, unhurried. From the shadows of the hall, Alexander Sterling emerged, tall, impeccably dressed, the kind of man who had built his life on the illusion of power. His lips curled into a knowing smirk as he took them in. "Cashin Thorne, I was beginning to wonder when you'd finally show up." Cashin's posture didn't change, but Sarah felt the tension ripple through him. "I don't have time for your theatrics, Sterling," he said coldly. "We both know why I'm here." Sterling chuckled. "Do we?" He glanced at Sarah. "And what about you, Miss Calloway? I must say, I didn't expect you to survive this long." Sarah held his gaze, her spine straight. "Disappointed?" Sterling smirked. "Not at all. I admire resilience." Cashin took a step forward, voice turning razor sharp. "I don't care what you admire. I want answers. I want names." Sterling sighed, shaking his head. Always so impatient. He turned slightly, motioning toward the long dining table set against the far wall. A single bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses sat atop it, untouched. "Drink," he offered. Cashin didn't move. "Talk." Sterling smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Very well." He leaned against the table, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood. "You should have let this go, Thorne. You had everything. Wealth, control, freedom. But you just couldn't stop digging, could you?" Cashin's expression remained unreadable. "You tried to kill me." Sterling let out a quiet chuckle. "I did." Sarah's breath hitched. He wasn't even denying it. Cashin's hands flexed at his sides, but his voice remained deathly calm. "And when that didn't work, you came after her." Sterling shrugged. "You made it personal the moment you decided to play detective. She was just leverage." His gaze flickered towards Sarah again. A means to an end. Sarah's stomach twisted. Cashin exhaled slowly. "And Ezra?" Sterling's smirk faltered. Cashin tilted his head slightly. He thought he was untouchable, too. Sterling's expression darkened. "Ezra was a fool. He let his emotions cloud his judgment. He should have killed you when he had the chance." Cashin took another step forward. "Then why didn't you?" Sterling's smirk returned, but there was something colder beneath it now. "Because I wanted you to suffer first." The air between them was razor thin. Sarah's fingers curled into fists at her sides, anger pulsing beneath her skin. Sterling was toying with them, treating this like some kind of game. But Cashin wasn't playing. He moved so fast Sarah barely registered it. 1 second he was standing still. The next he had Sterling pinned against the dining table, a hand wrapped around his throat. Sterling didn't struggle, didn't fight back. He simply smiled. "You won't kill me, Thorne," he rasped. Cashin's grip tightened. "You sure about that?" Sterling let out a quiet laugh. "You need me alive." Sarah inhaled sharply. Cashin hesitated, just for a second, and that was all it took. A gunshot echoed through the room. Sarah flinched as Cashin jerked back, a pained sound escaping his throat. Her mind barely had time to process it. Cashin, staggering, his hand pressed against his side, blood seeping through his fingers. Then she saw him. A second man, stepping from the shadows. Wallace. Her stomach twisted. Betrayal. Again. Cashin let out a slow, shaky breath, his hand still clutching his side. "You should have run, Wallace." The butler's face was impassive. "I did what I had to do." Sarah's pulse thundered. Sterling straightened, smoothing out his jacket, his smirk returning as he turned to Wallace. "Finish it." Wallace raised the gun again. Sarah moved. She didn't think. She just reacted. Lunging forward, she grabbed the whiskey bottle from the table and swung. The glass shattered against Wallace's temple. He stumbled, the gun slipping from his grasp. Cashin didn't waste a second. Ignoring the pain, he grabbed Wallace's collar and slammed him into the floor. Sarah turned to Sterling, her breath sharp. He was already backing away. "You don't want to do this, Miss Calloway," he murmured. Sarah clenched her fists. "You don't know what I want." Sterling smirked. "Then I suppose we'll find out." He reached into his jacket. Cashin fired. The gunshot was deafening. Sterling collapsed. Sarah's breath came fast, uneven, but she didn't look away. Cashin stood over him, the gun still in his grip, his expression unreadable. Sterling coughed, blood staining his lips. "You?" Cashin tilted his head. "I told you." Ezra thought he was untouchable, too. Sterling's smirk finally faded. Cashin lowered the gun, his voice quiet. "This is over." Sarah exhaled, her pulse still pounding. The nightmare had ended. But the war? It had only just begun. The scent of gunpowder still hung thick in the air. Sarah's ears rang from the gunshot, her pulse hammering in her throat. Her breath came fast and uneven as she took in the wreckage before her. Sterling lay motionless on the cold marble floor, blood seeping from the gunshot wound in his chest. His breathing was shallow, his once arrogant smirk replaced with something dazed, something broken. Cashin stood over him, the gun still gripped tightly in his hand. His entire body was tense, his expression unreadable, but Sarah could see it, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The end of a war that had started years ago. Wallace groaned from where he lay nearby, struggling to push himself up, his face bloodied from where Sarah had smashed the whiskey bottle against his skull. His eyes flickered between Cashin and Sterling, panic flashing across his features for the first time. Sterling coughed, blood staining his lips. His fingers twitched against the floor, his breath rattling. He looked up at Cashin, something sharp and venomous still lingering in his gaze. "You think this ends with me?" His voice was weak, but there was a twisted kind of triumph in it. "You'll never be free of this, Thorne." Cashin tilted his head slightly, his grip on the gun unwavering. "You're bleeding out on the floor," he said calmly. "I'd say I'm closer to freedom than you are." Sterling let out a breathy chuckle, then winced. "If you kill me, others will come." Cashin stared down at him, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly lifted the gun again, pressing the barrel just beneath Sterling's chin. Sarah's breath caught. Cashin's finger hovered over the trigger, his entire body coiled like a predator ready to strike. For a moment, she thought he was going to do it. For a moment, she thought this was how it would end. Then, at the last second, Cashin exhaled and lowered the gun. "You're not worth the bullet." Sterling's eyes flickered with something almost like surprise. Cashin glanced toward Wallace, his expression turning colder. "Call the police." Wallace let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You think they'll believe you?" Cashin arched a brow. "I have enough financial records to tie Sterling to multiple offshore accounts, shell companies, and illegal dealings. I'm sure they'll be interested in hearing all about his operations." Sterling let out a shuddering breath, his eyes fluttering shut. Cashin stepped back, finally turning toward Sarah. His face softened just slightly, but there was something else there, something raw. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I think I should be the one asking you that." Cashin smirked faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then, suddenly, his balance wavered. His hand shot out, gripping the back of a chair to steady himself. A sharp hiss of pain escaped his lips. Sarah's stomach clenched. "Cashin, I'm fine," he muttered, but she could already see the blood soaking through his shirt. Her pulse spiked. "No, you're not." Cashin let out a slow breath, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "We need to." He never finished the sentence. His legs buckled. Sarah lunged forward just in time to catch him before he hit the ground. Sarah's knees hit the marble floor as she caught Cashin's collapsing body. His weight was heavy against her, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Blood seeped through his shirt, hot and sticky against her hands. "Cashin, stay with me," she whispered, pressing down on the wound to stop the bleeding. His eyelids fluttered, his jaw clenched as he fought to stay conscious. "I'm fine," he muttered, voice slurred. "Liar," Sarah shot back, but her voice trembled. Footsteps echoed behind her. She whipped around, her muscles coiled, ready for another fight. But it wasn't an enemy. It was Wallace. For a moment, they just stared at each other. The man who had betrayed Cashin. The man who had stood by while others tried to kill them. And yet, there was something different in his face now. A hesitation. A flicker of something almost like guilt. "Help me," Sarah ordered, her voice sharp. Wallace hesitated, then nodded. Together, they lifted Cashin, supporting his weight as they moved him to a nearby chair. Sarah's hands were shaking, but she didn't let herself stop. Not yet. Wallace disappeared down the hallway, returning moments later with a first aid kit and a clean cloth. He handed them to her without a word. Sarah didn't question why he was helping. She just worked. Her hands moved quickly, pressing the cloth against the wound, tying it tightly to slow the bleeding. Cashin let out a low grunt of pain, his fingers gripping the arms of the chair. "Try not to pass out," she muttered, her voice softer now. Cashin smirked faintly, though it barely lasted a second. "Bossy. Survival instincts," she murmured, her throat tightening. She refused to let her hands shake as she worked, refused to let herself feel the fear clawing at her chest. Cashin wasn't dying. Not tonight. Not after everything. The minutes stretched, the silence thick, heavy with everything unsaid. Then, sirens. Distant at first, then louder. Sarah exhaled, tension bleeding from her shoulders. Cashin let out a low chuckle. "You called the cops?" "No," Wallace said quietly. "I did." Sarah's head snapped toward him. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I may have made the wrong choice before." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Consider this my way of making it right." Sarah studied him, searching for deception. But there was none. Maybe he had been a coward. Maybe he had been weak. But in the end, when it mattered, he had made a choice. And for now, that was enough. She turned back to Cashin, brushing his damp hair away from his forehead. "You're going to be okay." His fingers found hers, his grip weak but steady. "You really believe that?" Sarah swallowed. "I have to." The next few days passed in a blur. Sterling had survived the gunshot, only to be taken into police custody as soon as he was stable. The evidence Cashin had gathered was more than enough to bury him for life. Wallace had disappeared. Cashin, despite everything, refused to press charges against him. "A man has to live with his choices," he had said. "That's punishment enough." As for Cashin himself, Sarah sat beside his hospital bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. He was pale, exhaustion clear in the sharp lines of his face, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. The door creaked open. Cashin stirred, his eyes flickering open as she turned toward him. "You're supposed to be resting," she said. He smirked faintly. "And you're supposed to be gone by now." Her breath caught. He was right. She had already done what she came to do. The job was over. Cashin didn't need a caretaker anymore. She should have left, but she hadn't. Cashin studied her carefully. "You're still here." Sarah exhaled slowly. "Yeah." Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then, finally, Cashin spoke. "I don't know what happens next." His voice was quiet, hesitant in a way she had never heard before. "I don't know how to be," he swallowed. "This." Sarah's chest tightened. She reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. "Then we figure it out." Cashin looked at her, really looked at her. And then he let go. Not of her, not of the past, but of the weight he had been carrying for so long. And for the first time, Cashin Thorne wasn't running anymore.